Hello, welcome to our presentation for the Recent Advances of Natural Language Processing Conference in 2023. This presentation is the paper that was accepted with John E. Ortega and Kenneth W. Church from Northeastern University. This is a research-based guide for the creation and deployment of a low-resource machine translation system. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about what this paper covers in the introduction. Then I will talk about some of the current challenges as we see them of a low-resource machine translation system, how one would work with a minimum viable product, then talk about the related work, talk about some of the issues in quality and how to solve them, and lastly some workarounds and conclusion. So first and foremost, I realize that this is an NLP conference, so I will talk about the low-resource machine translation side of things. Basically, at a high level, machine translation is simply translating from one source language to a target language. Oftentimes, we train models to do that translation in a digital way. We have languages that don't have as much data, particularly parallel data, meaning data and the source and then the target language in a parallel format. So when we lack those types of resources, we oftentimes have to use other solutions, not just the straightforward training of a parallel corpus. So we thought that there may be some value to better understanding this from the corporation side or those who are trying to deploy a low-resource machine translation into a community. We oftentimes feel that bigger is better and faster is better, and anything that we can give to the community is the better way to go, but we kind of disagree with that. And sometimes corporations get it wrong. You know, they have a lot of big corporations have lots of people and resources to work on problems, and oftentimes are first in research to do things. But I think maybe sometimes on the business side and deployment side of the machine translation systems, especially when we deal with low resource translation, they have a few things that they need to keep in mind. We talk a little bit about the Bender rule. The idea is that a lot of the languages or a lot of the MT systems you see are mostly for high resource languages like English and Spanish, for example. Most of the low resource MT that's done is typically going into one of those target languages, and oftentimes the other languages are just ignored. So we feel that there's some type of responsibility here that lies on the low resource MT creator and deployer, and we have tried to outline that in this paper. So some of the challenges that we feel have to be overcome in order for a company or a corporation to deploy a low resource MT system are the following. So first, we feel that there has to be demand for the system. Just because you've reached something really cool in research doesn't necessarily mean there's a business demand for it, meaning does the target community actually want or need this system? Then the cost has to kind of be beneficial in some way for a business. So yes, you can consider deploying a low resource MT system as a corporation. I think it makes a lot of sense. But is the cost benefit there? Meaning, if you deploy this system, will you have enough users, and will those users in some way or another lead to higher revenue? Lastly, I think there's a quality issue. So those three things are kind of the challenges, meaning the system has to be of pretty good quality for people to even begin to consider using it in some way or another. So those three things are kind of high-level things that are touched on in this paper: demand, cost, and quality. And all of that is really wrapped into one really quick question that a company can ask themselves before they deploy a system. Does the low resource MT system provide value to the target community? Meaning, is there some way or another that this system that you're deploying in the wild, going to be used in some way that's going to benefit the target community? And then finally, we provide, or we kind of, in this paper, we answer the questions if there are any workarounds for deployment. Meaning, you may not actually hit all of those or overcome those three challenges. Are there workarounds for deployment? So first, minimal viable product, or the MVP. I guess from the business standpoint of view, people, especially startups, will have to build some type of MVP when they build a product. When you're dealing with low resource MT systems, you have to oftentimes take into consideration these 4 points again. Is it really worth it? The low resource community that you're deploying the system for and hope that they use, will they actually use this thing considering the quality that was shown by the system? And then, of course, we'll talk about some of those quality metrics later, but I guess the demand is very important too. In other words, do the people that you are targeting, or the community that you're targeting, does that community even have the resources to run your MT system? So I think it's also on a conscious side. We oftentimes, as practitioners in this domain, consider just throwing things out there because we want to fail fast. But I think with this type of system, and we kind of believe that before you pull the trigger and deploy a system in the wild, you got to think, are you doing the socially responsible thing? This is a pretty hot topic right now with responsible AI, and at Northeastern we have really dug deep into a lot of these issues, and we feel that some of the low resource MT systems, along with others, have found that they're the systems that we're deploying out in the wild as a community are not really taking things into account. So I'm not going to go too deep into the related work, but the main projects or the main points that were covered in the related work are the deployment, the quality, the evaluation, bias and culture, which we didn't really mention as a challenge, but it is really part of the social responsibility part of things. And then lastly, domain specificity. So all of these are kind of covered in a related work in a survey type of way, but I would take it with a grain of salt. We didn't cover all and every paper that covers or that touches on low resource MT. We more specifically tried at a high level to touch some of the highly indexed ones with the most citations and so forth from these 5 different topics. So feel free to read the paper. I think you'll see that there are pretty good citations there, and they've been updated for the camera-ready version of the paper. So quality, as we see it, how do I know as a company or even as a person that's going to deploy a low-resource MT system that my system performs well? Well, one can ask some very high-level questions, which are, is this system performing similar to, say, a professional translator would perform? One automatically thinks, especially from the MT world, as a researcher, we oftentimes think, oh, blue, is it getting 80s, 90s blue, and it should be fine. But that's not always the case, and we've shown that in the past. Now, also verified by humans. Have someone that is well versed in the target language or has some knowledge of the target language been able to verify the translations and fluency and several other kind of metrics that we propose in this paper. How well does your MT system adjust to the domain? Are you training things on the Bible and then running them on legal text, this type of thing. Bias-free, and this is a tough one. Low resource MT is it is what it is. There's very few resources, so oftentimes we skip over the problem or issue of bias. And lastly, it hasn't been evaluated for accuracy, meaning can we go through the low resource MT system, run it on a test set, and then evaluate it for accuracy outside of the normal metrics. And then more importantly, there is no substitute for a human in the loop. We at EAI have definitely talked about having the human in the loop, and we think it's an important piece to this. We feel that at a minimum, at least with the digital scores and metrics that are out there, we should be able to get the minimal scores of proper evaluation metrics such as BLUE, COMET, Meteor, and the list goes on. And we have those in the paper. So some of the workarounds that we propose, in other words, if you don't have all of these already readily at hand and you can't meet all of these challenges, the hope would be that you could at least try to do some of this, meaning two major pieces or points: include humans in some way. There's a such thing as acceptance loops or active learning. Crowdsourcing, you can crowdsource your translations if you don't have in-house people to do things. And of course, there are more. Feel free to read the paper to see some of the other ways that one can include a human. And then lastly, you can try subdomains instead, meaning you could specifically look to go translate text that you may have some corpus on. For example, again, I don't want to train my legal translator from, let's say, Quechua to Spanish on just the Bible. So sometimes you can aid that using different techniques for monolingual texts that are in the specific domain. And then finally, you have the lack of data problem. If you don't have the data in the subdomain or other domains, you probably don't want to mix the MT system across domains, especially when in a low resource situation. Finally, the conclusion. We present this as a practical guide for low resource MT. This is by no means should one make a mistake, meaning once you pull the trigger and deploy the system, especially if you're a big corporation, your deployment may have not been viable and it may have been a huge mistake. Always measure the risk versus the rewards, the cost versus the quality. Lastly, remember the less amount of data that you have, typically it means the worse results you're going to get. Now, that's not always the case. One says, well, I could always run, the latest and greatest with large language models. But even so, even with small amounts of data, while we are impressed, they still aren't up to par for translations, human translations. Following the workaround, we have humans and subdomains. And you can obviously read the paper about how one could go around the domains in humans and so forth. So I want to thank everyone again for joining my presentation and listening in. Here are our emails if you're interested. And yeah, hope to hear more from you. Thank you.